In the dusty streets of the American frontier, where wooden saloons stood shoulder to shoulder with ramshackle stables, there was one figure everyone recognized: the sheriff. His badge might have been small, but the weight of it was heavier than any gun he carried. From the crack of dawn to the stillness of midnight, the sheriff's duty never truly ended. He wasn't just an enforcer of the law. He was the very heartbeat of a town that could easily slip into chaos. Imagine waking each morning knowing that any day could bring a stagecoach robbery, a heated shootout in a saloon, or a desperate plea from a family whose cattle had vanished overnight. The sheriff had to be ready for all of it. Some days meant chasing outlaws across the wide, unforgiving plains, with nothing but a horse beneath him in the hope that he'd catch up before sundown. Other days meant long hours inside cramped courtrooms, delivering justice with nothing more than his words and the trust of the townsfolk. Yet, beyond the drama of high noon duels and dusty jailbreaks, life as a sheriff was deeply human. He was part of every handshake, every town meeting, every whispered worry from neighbors who relied on him not just as an officer, but as a protector, a mediator, and sometimes even a peacemaker in a land where tempers burned as hot as the desert sun. The sheriff's work was unpredictable, dangerous, and often thankless, but it was also a role that shaped legends. These were men who stood at the fragile line between law and lawlessness, trying to carve out justice in a world that seemed determined to resist it. And while dime novels and Hollywood films have painted sheriffs as invincible heroes with iron wills, the truth is far more complex and, perhaps, even more fascinating. They were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances, relying on grit, quick thinking, and a deep sense of responsibility to hold their communities together. In this story, we're going to step into their boots, walk the dirt roads of their towns, and uncover what daily life was really like for a sheriff of the Wild West. What pressures did they face? How did they balance survival with justice? And what made them symbols of both fear and respect? By the end, you might find yourself questioning whether you could have survived even a single week wearing the sheriff's star. Before we dive deeper into this untamed world of outlaws, dusty trails, and hard choices, don't forget to support this channel. A simple tap on the like button helps this story reach more curious minds like yours. And subscribing ensures you'll never miss the next journey into history's most dramatic corners. Share it with friends who love tales of courage, resilience, and human struggle, because together we can keep these stories alive. Saddle up, because the sheriff's day is just beginning. A Wild West sheriff was more than just a man with a badge and a revolver. He carried on his shoulders the fragile hopes of an entire town. For in those unsettled days when danger could arrive as suddenly as a desert storm, people needed more than laws written on paper. They needed someone who embodied those laws, someone who could stand firm when tempers flared, when property disputes turned into armed standoffs, or when the clatter of boots outside a saloon warned of yet another drunken fight about to erupt into violence. He was not merely an enforcer of order. He was also the face of authority that children recognized when they passed him on the boardwalk. The mediator neighbors turned to when arguments over land or cattle grew too heated, and the figure who reminded the restless drifters and gamblers that, no matter how far they had wandered from civilization, justice still walked among them. To lead a community in the Wild West meant living in constant tension between compassion and strength. The sheriff could not afford to be cold or distant, for he had to win the trust of townsfolk who depended on him not only to protect them, but also to represent their voices in matters that reached beyond the dusty streets of their settlement. At town meetings, he listened patiently to farmers pleading for help against rustlers, to merchants demanding safer roads for their wagons, and to families who simply wanted the comfort of knowing that their children could sleep safely at night. Yet, when words failed and danger reared its head, he had to shift instantly into the role of protector, ready to strap on his gun belt, call upon his deputies, or form a posse and ride into the wilderness where the line between hunter and hunted, blurred with every mile of trail. The balance he maintained was a delicate one for a sheriff who relied only on fear would soon lose the respect of his people, while one who sought only friendship, without the strength to back it up, would find his town overrun by lawlessness. What made a sheriff truly remarkable was not his speed with a revolver or his booming voice in a crowded saloon, but his ability to command loyalty while inspiring confidence, to deliver stern justice without forgetting that behind every outlaw's mask or desperate act was still a human story shaped by hardship, greed, or survival. His role demanded wisdom far beyond the law books, a kind of leadership that could not be taught but had to be earned each day through action, fairness, and courage. In this way, the sheriff was not just the guardian of law, but also the very thread that held the fabric of the community together, a figure whose presence reminded every settler, merchant, and wanderer that even in the most remote corners of the frontier society could endure as long as someone was willing to shoulder the burden of both justice and unity. Life for a sheriff was shaped not only by the weight of his badge, but also by the unforgiving realities of the frontier towns he called home. Places that were often little more than a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by endless plains or barren deserts, where every resource was scarce and every comfort hard-earned. These towns rarely had more than a handful of shops, a single schoolhouse, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and perhaps one dusty jail cell that seemed far too small to contain the dangers pressing in from all directions. In such an environment, the sheriff had to learn to do more with less, improvising with whatever tools, manpower, and cooperation had, because unlike the polished officers in distant cities, he could not rely on large forces, advanced equipment, or even steady pay. His office was often nothing more than a cramped room with a desk, a ledger, a few wanted posters tacked to the wall, and a rifle leaning in the corner. Yet, from that humble space, he was expected to uphold law and order across miles of rugged, lawless land. The challenges of limited resources tested not only his skills, but his character. For every decision carried weight when there was no cavalry to call upon, and no reinforcements waiting just beyond the horizon. If a group of outlaws rode into town, the sheriff might have only one or two deputies at his side, and sometimes not even that, forcing him to rely on the courage of ordinary townsfolk. Men who by day were blacksmiths, ranchers, or storekeepers, but who, when danger arrived, could be sworn in as part of a posse to defend their community. Supplies were stretched thin as well. Bullets were costly, horses required constant care, and even food and clean water could not be taken for granted. To protect his people, the sheriff had to master the art of resourcefulness, knowing when to conserve ammunition, when to chase a fugitive across the open plains, and when it was wiser to wait, observe, and use patience as his most powerful weapon. What made this role even more demanding was that the sheriff's responsibilities extended far beyond chasing criminals. With so few officials in these frontier towns, he often found himself acting as judge, negotiator, tax collector, and even messenger, bridging the gap between isolated settlements and distant territorial authorities. Each of these tasks required him to stretch the limits of his time and energy, and yet the people never doubted that, when the moment came, their sheriff would stand ready to protect them, even if it meant risking his own life with nothing more than a revolver, steady hand, and the determination to see justice done. It was in these small, resource-starved towns that the legend of the Wild West Sheriff truly took shape. Not because he possessed endless power or grand facilities, but because he learned to turn scarcity into strength, drawing resilience from the very hardships that surrounded him, and proving to his people that even in the most desolate corners of the frontier, law and order could survive if someone had the courage to fight for it. Out on the frontier, a sheriff's responsibility was rarely confined to the cluster of buildings that made up his town, for his badge carried weight across vast stretches of countryside, covering isolated farms, remote ranches, and lonely homesteads scattered miles apart from one another, where the nearest neighbor might be a full day's ride away, and where danger could arrive long before help ever did. This meant that the sheriff's world was not bounded by the dusty main street where the saloons and general stores stood, but by the endless horizon itself. And whenever a rider galloped into town with word of troubling, it was cattle thieves, a brewing feud between ranchers, or a traveler robbed along the trail, the sheriff had no choice but to saddle up and carry his duty into the wide, untamed counties that lay beyond the edge of civilization. These long rides through open country tested not just his endurance, but his judgment, for he was often the only figure of authority people would ever see. The one man who could settle disputes, deliver justice, or bring reassurance in times of fear. Farmers relied on him to mediate quarrels over water rights or boundary lines. Ranchers expected him to confront rustlers who disappeared into the hills with stolen cattle. And travelers trusted that his presence alone could make the law feel real in places where it might otherwise seem like nothing more than an idea carried from the East. Yet such authority was a double-edged sword, for it required him to act with fairness and restraint, even when tempers ran high and guns were close at hand, knowing that a single misstep could ignite violence and turn neighbors into enemies for generations. The vastness of his jurisdiction also meant that he often faced moments of isolation, riding for hours under the relentless sun or through storms that swept across the plains. Guided only by his instincts, his horse, and the quiet weight of the badge on his chest. In those moments, far from the safety of town, he had to summon his own courage, because when he arrived at a lonely homestead under threat, there was no one to back him up, no courthouse within reach, only his words, his resolve, and, if necessary, the weapon at his side. Despite the danger, the sheriff's authority beyond town was what bound scattered communities together, creating a fragile thread of order across the wilderness, reminding every settler that even in the most remote corners of the county, they were not entirely alone, because someone had sworn to ride as far as it took to carry justice to their door. The heart of the sheriff's duty was not measured only by how far he could ride or how many miles of countryside his authority covered, but by his constant responsibility to keep peace and order in places where disorder seemed to lurk around every corner. For these frontier towns and rural settlements were often turbulent by nature, built on ambition, survival, and the clash of so many different lives brought together in harsh conditions. On any given day, a sheriff might find himself breaking up a drunken brawl in a saloon before it escalated into something far bloodier, calming tempers between ranchers feuding over land or cattle, or standing firm in the face of a mob determined to take justice into their own hands. In such moments, he became more than a lawman with a gun. He was a mediator, a voice of reason, and at times the only barrier between a fragile community and outright chaos. The rough environments in which he served amplified every challenge. Streets were unpaved and dusty in the summer, turning into deep mud when the rains came. Saloons overflowed with cowboys, eager to spend their wages after months on the trail. Lana strangers, arriving from distant places, often carried tempers, grudges, or habits that clashed violently with the delicate balance of the town. In this setting, peace was not something that existed naturally, but something that had to be worked for every single day, maintained through vigilance, quick thinking, and an ability to command respect without always reaching for a weapon. The sheriff's presence on the street, his steady walk down Main, his calm but watchful eyes scanning the crowd, these small actions could sometimes do more to keep order than any number of laws written on paper. For people often obeyed not the letter of the law, but the man who stood behind it. To keep order, the sheriff had to understand human nature as much as he understood the law, learning when to be stern, and when to show leniency, when to let a quarrel burn itself out, and when to step in before words turned to blows. In a world where tempers flared quickly and honor was guarded fiercely, a single misjudged decision could end in tragedy. So the sheriff's greatest tool was often not his revolver, but his ability to read a room to sense when trouble was about to spark and to diffuse it before it consumed the town. His role was never glamorous, but it was vital for in an environment where hardship and uncertainty already weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders. The assurance of a steady hand keeping watch was sometimes the only thing that kept a community from unraveling. When the fragile peace of a settlement was broken, when word spread that a thief had struck under the cover of darkness, or that a band of riders had stormed through, leaving fear in their wake, it was the sheriff who shouldered the responsibility of pursuit, for no matter how vast the wilderness or how treacherous the trails, he could not allow lawlessness to take root and grow unchecked. To chase such men was not a task of comfort or certainty, but of grit, patience, and the willingness to ride for days across barren plains, through jagged canyons, and into dense woodlands where danger lurked behind every shadow. Each criminal posed a different challenge. The thief who slipped quietly from one town to another, blending into the crowd and leaving little more than whispers behind. The tainted who relied on speed and ferocity, hoping to vanish into the horizon before law could catch up. Core, the outlaw whose name alone stirred both fear and admiration. K, a figure who seemed larger than life and yet was still flesh and blood to be hunted down. The sheriff's pursuit was as much a test of character as it was of endurance, for it required him to balance the urgency of swift justice with the discipline of careful strategy, to track signs in the dust, broken twigs, or faint trails left behind by men who knew how to cover their tracks, and to rely not just on his own instincts, but also on the loyalty of those willing to ride with him when the chase demanded more hands. These pursuits often stretched far beyond the borders of a single town, carrying the sheriff deep into landscapes that mirrored the unpredictability of the men he hunted. Landscapes where silence could suddenly erupt with the crack of gunfire, or where days of solitude on the trail gave way to tense confrontations that tested his resolve. In such moments, the sheriff's role as protector and pursuer intertwined, for he did not chase merely to punish, but to send a message to the people who looked to him for safety. That crime would not be ignored, that wrongs would not be left unanswered, and that no matter how far a man might run, the law embodied in the weary yet unyielding figure of the sheriff would ride behind him. These pursuits became stories retold in saloons and around campfires, not as tales of glory, but as reminders of the burden one man carried, so that the many could sleep without fear, knowing that even in the untamed reaches of the West, someone was willing to ride into uncertainty in the name of justice. Beyond the long chases across desolate country, the sheriff's days were filled with a constant stream of conflicts that tested both his patience and his strength, for the Wild West was a place where livelihoods were fragile and disputes could erupt into violence with little warning. Cattle rustling was not merely the theft of livestock, but an attack on the very heart of a rancher. Survival, and when herds were driven off under the cover of night, the sheriff was often the only figure expected to intervene, riding out to follow faint tracks across open ranges, negotiating between furious ranch owners, and working to prevent feuds from turning into all-out wars between neighbors. Each case of stolen cattle was more than a crime. It was a spark that could ignite deeper conflicts in a community already stretched thin by hardship, and the sheriff's role was to extinguish it before flames spread beyond control. Then there were the stagecoach robberies, daring acts that shook entire regions because they struck not just at individuals, but at the very flow of commerce, communication, and trust that connected far-flung settlements to the wider world. Passengers found themselves stripped of valuables, mail was intercepted, and sometimes lives were endangered by outlaws who used sudden ambushes in narrow passes or dense brush to their advantage. To the sheriff, these robberies represented more than stolen goods. They were challenges to stability itself, brazen reminders that the wilderness still threatened to swallow civilization whole, and each investigation demanded not only courage, but a keen ability to anticipate where and when such attacks might strike again. And, Of course, there were the saloon fights, the nightly spectacles where strong drink and bruised pride collided under dim lantern light, often erupting into chaos before anyone could stop it. A sheriff had to step into the center of these storms, not as a brute enforcer, but as a steady presence who could calm tempers before bottles turned to weapons or fists gave way to revolvers. These fights may have seemed trivial compared to rustlers or robbers, yet they carried their own dangers. For one wrong move could escalate a brawl into a tragedy that scarred an entire town. Managing these situations required more than physical strength. It demanded respect, authority, and the ability to remind men who had forgotten themselves that peace was a prize worth keeping. In all of these challenges, whether guarding the cattle trails, securing the stage roads, or walking through swinging doors into the tense heat of a saloon, Sheriff stood at the center of a delicate balance, always navigating between chaos and calm violence and restraint, knowing that his presence could mean the difference between a community that endured and one that fractured under the weight of its own conflicts. What truly defined the sheriff's work was not only the ability to confront danger with steel and grit, but the far quieter and more delicate art of keeping peace through words, for in communities where tempers burned hot and pride often mattered as much as property maintaining, public safety demanded skills in negotiation and mediation that were as vital as any weapon he carried on his belt. A sheriff had to know when to raise his voice and when to lower it, when to let two men argue until their anger was spent, and when to step between them before words sharpened into threats. And, most importantly, he had to know how to make each side feel heard, even when neither was willing to yield. These small acts of diplomacy played out in dusty streets, crowded saloons, or the wooden benches of a town hall often carried far more weight than the crack of a revolver, because they reminded the people that the law was not only about punishment, but about fairness, balance, and the preservation of a community where neighbors could coexist without tearing each other apart. In this role, the sheriff became a kind of anchor in the storm, listening to ranchers feuding over water rights, merchants quarreling about debts, or settlers clashing over land boundaries. And though he had the authority to impose decisions, he understood that true peace came only when disputes ended with both sides believing they had been treated with dignity. His words had to be chosen carefully, steady enough to calm a heated room, yet firm enough to make clear that respect for order was not optional, but essential to survival in such harsh and uncertain lands. There were no courts of appeal waiting in every frontier town, no endless pages of legal codes to consult. Instead, the sheriff's wisdom, his sense of justice, and his ability to read the shifting moods of those before him became the foundation upon which peace rested. Every successful negotiation, every quarrel quieted before it turned violent, reinforced the sheriff's standing in the eyes of his people, but they saw in him not just an enforcer of laws, but a guardian of harmony, someone willing to stand in the middle of the storm and hold it back with nothing more than conviction, patience, and a steady voice. It was this balance between strength and restraint, authority and empathy, that made the sheriff more than just a figure of power. He became the living embodiment of the fragile peace the frontier so desperately needed. Yet, even when disputes were settled and tempers cooled, the sheriff's true challenge lay in the delicate balance between upholding justice and ensuring that the people whose lives he governed did not see him as a tyrant, but as a trusted guardian. For justice on the frontier could not exist in a vacuum. It had to be lived, witnessed, and accepted by the very townsfolk whose cooperation was essential for survival. The sheriff knew that if he enforced the law too harshly, the town might resent him, whispering behind closed doors and turning their backs when he needed their support most. Yet, if he allowed too much leniency, if he ignored wrongdoings in the name of keeping the peace, order would dissolve, and the sense of fairness that bound the community together would crumble into suspicion and bitterness. Every decision carried weight far beyond the single moment in which it was made. When a ranch hand stole food to feed his family, was it justice to punish him as a thief, or wisdom to show mercy and prevent hunger from breeding desperation throughout the settlement? When a respected townsman broke the law in a fit of anger, was it better to treat him like any other criminal or to temper judgment with understanding so that the fragile unity of the town was not torn apart? These were the questions the sheriff faced not once, but again and again, and each answer shaped how the people looked upon him not just as a man of authority, but as a mirror of the values they wished their community to uphold. It was this constant act of balancing walking the narrow line between strict justice and compassionate leadership that made the sheriff's role so complex. He could not rely solely on his badge or his revolver to command respect, for respect in such places was earned not by fear but by fairness, by showing the townsfolk that his hand was steady and his judgment, even that he did not serve his own pride, but the well-being of all. In this way, the sheriff became not just an enforcer of laws, but a keeper of trust, weaving together justice and cooperation into a fragile but vital harmony that allowed frontier life to endure despite its many hardships. Although townspeople often imagined a sheriff surrounded by loyal deputies, ready at a moment's notice to ride into danger at his side, the reality of frontier life was far lonelier, for while deputies were sometimes appointed to share the burden in many places, the sheriff carried the weight of the badge almost entirely on his own. A small settlement could rarely afford to pay more than one lawman, and even when deputies were chosen, they were often little more than volunteers. Shopkeepers, ranch hands, or miners who agreed to lend a hand when trouble flared, men whose loyalty might be strong but whose training and availability were uncertain at best. This left the sheriff 2 shoulder-long nights of patrol by himself, walking quiet streets lit only by lantern glow, or riding alone across miles of open country in search of fugitives who might be armed and desperate. Solitude became part of the job, not just in the silence of empty roads, but in the knowledge that every decision, every confrontation, and every risk fell squarely on his shoulders. When he entered a saloon to break up a brawl, there was often no deputy waiting at his back. When he set out after a rustler or a bandit, he knew that the posse might not arrive until long after he had already caught up with danger. This loneliness sharpened his instincts, teaching him to read situations quickly, to gauge when to act and when to wait, because hesitation or misjudgment could mean standing alone against overwhelming odds. Yet, this solitude also carved a kind of resilience into the sheriff's character, for it forced him to rely on his own wits, his own strength, and his own unwavering sense of duty. The townsfolk, whether they admitted it or not, drew comfort from the sight of him riding down Main Street or standing calmly outside the jailhouse, a solitary figure whose very presence seemed to promise that the town was not unprotected, even if the man himself had no one to lean on. In that way, the sheriff's loneliness became a quiet act of service, a sacrifice made so that others might believe in the fragile safety of their world. And though history often remembers the legends of lawmen leading bands of deputies into battle with outlaws, the truth is that many of those who wore the badge did their work in silence and solitude, carrying the burden of law with no companion but their own determination. The tools that a sheriff relied upon in those unforgiving lands were not elaborate symbols of power but the plain, practical weapons of the frontier, for a revolver holstered at his side, a rifle slung across the saddle, or a shotgun kept close at hand, often made the difference between survival and defeat in a world where danger could appear without warning. These weapons were not carried for display, nor brandished to intimidate. They were extensions of responsibility, heavy reminders that at any moment the sheriff might be called upon to defend not only himself, but the lives of those who looked to him for protection. The revolver, light enough to be drawn swiftly, yet steady enough to command respect, was his constant companion, a tool of last resort when words failed and order teetered on the edge of collapse. The rifle, with its range and precision, served as the sheriff's ally on long pursuits, allowing him to meet threats across open plains or from the cover of rocky outcrops where outlaws thought themselves untouchable. And the shotgun, blunt and devastating, was the weapon of choice in close quarters. It's the equalizer in crowded saloons or narrow alleys where danger pressed in too suddenly for hesitation. Yet, despite carrying these instruments of force, the sheriff did not lean on them recklessly, for he understood that each shot fired carried consequences far beyond the target, echoing through the fragile trust of the community he served. His strength lay not in how often he drew his weapons, but in how rarely he had to. For a sheriff who could command respect through presence and words preserved more peace than one who ruled by the crack of gunfire. Still, the weight of those weapons was a constant reminder that peace was fragile and could shatter in an instant, and so the sheriff bore them with a sober acceptance, knowing that in the vast emptiness of the frontier, the line between calm and chaos was often no thicker than the trigger beneath his finger. To the townsfolk, the sight of the badge glinting beside the worn handle of a revolver was enough to assure them that their lawman was prepared for whatever might come, even if he prayed each day that his hands would not be forced to use the tools that kept the darkness at bay. Among the many responsibilities that rested on the shoulders of the sheriff, none carried more weight in the eyes of the community than the solemn act of making arrests and seeing that prisoners were delivered safely to face judgment, for it was in these moments that law truly showed its strength and its fairness. To apprehend a wrongdoer was rarely as simple as stepping forward and declaring the badge's authority. It often meant walking into situations thick with tension, where friends or kin of the accused might be watching, for a saloon crowd held its breath to see if defiance would flare, or where the fugitive himself weighed whether surrender or resistance would shape his fate. The sheriff had to move carefully, projecting enough authority to leave no doubt of the outcome while keeping a steady calm that prevented a dangerous spark from turning into an explosion of violence. Once an arrest was made, the task did not end with iron cuffs or a locked cell, for transporting prisoners across miles of open country was a trial in itself, demanding vigilance and endurance in equal measure. Outlaws were seldom willing to accept their fate quietly, and the journey from a dusty town jail to a distant courthouse or territorial prison was filled with perils, not only from escape attempts, but from ambushes by accomplices determined to free their captured comrade. A sheriff leading such a journey had to remain constantly alert, as scanning every ridge and canyon, ears attuned to the smallest sound that might signal danger, while also managing the logistics of food, water, and shelter for both prisoner and escort. These duties, though often unheralded in the stories later told around campfires, represented the backbone of justice in the West. For without the courage to seize a man from the midst of his allies, and without the endurance to deliver him through wild and hostile country to stand before the law, all other efforts at maintaining peace would have been hollow. The sheriff's quiet triumph was not in dramatic duels or sudden shootouts, but in the countless times he brought a prisoner safely to justice, proving to his town that the law did not end at the edge of Main Street, but traveled with them wherever his badge and his duty carried him. The badge a sheriff wore was more than a symbol of authority within the wooden limits of a frontier town. It carried with it a responsibility that reached outward into the wider framework of law, for he was bound not only to uphold the rules and ordinances crafted by local councils, but also to act as an enforcer of federal and territorial mandates that often arrived in the form of dusty proclamations or stern letters sealed with distant authority. This dual responsibility meant that his role straddled two worlds: the intimate, immediate concerns of townsfolk who wanted swift resolutions to everyday disputes, and the broader, sometimes impersonal reach of distant governments, intent on shaping order across sprawling lands that most of their officials had never even seen. To walk this line required the sheriff to be both diplomat and defender, translating the weight of faraway laws into terms his community could accept, while also making sure that local customs and needs did not drift so far into independence that they openly defied the broader systems of justice. At times, this balance placed him in precarious situations, for townspeople might grumble against taxes levied by unseen authorities or resist regulations that seemed ill-suited to frontier realities. And yet, the sheriff could not simply ignore them, for his duty was to embody the law in all its layers, from the smallest ordinance against public disorder to the sweeping decrees of the territory. This constant negotiation between the local and the federal gave the sheriff's office an unusual weight, making him not only the protector of his neighbors, but also the visible link between a remote government and a restless people who often questioned its relevance. In fulfilling this role, the sheriff became a figure both respected and scrutinized, admired for keeping order close to home, but sometimes resented for being the hand of a law that came from beyond the horizon. Still, by enforcing both sets of rules with fairness and consistency, he reminded his community that law was not merely a set of distant words, but a living force that shaped their survival, ensuring that justice, however imperfect, bound them to something larger than themselves. When the trail of crime stretched too far for one man to follow alone, the sheriff had the authority, and often the necessity to summon a posse, a group of able-bodied townsmen who would leave behind their plow shops or herds to ride at his side in pursuit of fugitives across the open countryside. These gatherings were rarely planned affairs, together in moments of urgency, quick, when word spread through the dusty streets that a thief had vanished into the hills, or a band of raiders had struck a stage road. And the sheriff, standing tall in the center of the commotion, would call upon the community not simply as their lawman, but as their leader. The posse was a reflection of the frontier itself, hastily assembled, diverse in skill and temperament, and bound together by a shared belief that order had to be defended, not merely expected. Riding with the posse was no small undertaking, for the men who answered the call often did so at great personal risk, knowing that the criminals they pursued would not hesitate to strike back, and the sheriff bore the heavy burden of guiding them with both courage and caution. He had to read the land like a book, discerning faint trails in the dust, broken branches along riverbanks, or the dying embers of a campfire left behind by those they hunted. Every mile carried the posse deeper into wild country, where storms could sweep suddenly across the plains, where mountains concealed ambushes, and where the silence of the night pressed upon men who wondered if they would see their homes again. Yet these pursuits were more than hunts. They were affirmations of a community's determination to defend itself, and the sheriff, at the head of the column, became the embodiment of that spirit. He knew that his leadership would determine whether the men returned with justice served or with stories of failure and loss, and so he tempered his urgency with the wisdom of restraint, pushing forward when the signs were clear, but holding back when danger threatened to outpace preparation. The posse was not an army, and the sheriff was not a general. Yet, in those tense hours of pursuit, he carried a responsibility just as grave, for he was guiding ordinary men into extraordinary circumstances where bravery and fear walked side by side. In the end, whether the fugitive was captured or escaped into the horizon, the act of organizing and leading a posse strengthened the bond between sheriff and townsfolk, reminding all who rode and all who stayed behind that justice was not the burden of one man alone, but a duty shared by an entire community, willing to follow their lawmen into the uncertain wilds for the sake of order and peace. Beyond the dust and drama of the open trail, a sheriff's duties often pulled him back into the quieter, but no less weighty, halls of local justice, where the work shifted from pursuit to procedure and from showdowns to signatures. The law did not begin and end with the capture of wrongdoers. It required the careful machinery of courts to function, and the sheriff stood as the indispensable link between the judge, gavel, and the lives of ordinary people. Serving warrants, subpoenas, and other official papers was not a glamorous task. Yet, it was a cornerstone of the system, ensuring that cases move forward and that citizens, whether accused, witness, or complainant, appeared when called. Carrying a warrant was not simply a matter of handing over a folded document. It often meant riding for miles to remote cabins or isolated ranches, arriving at a doorstep where suspicion and hostility might outweigh hospitality. Some residents viewed the sheriff not as a neighbor, but as an intruder, carrying the weight of authority, and more than once a seemingly routine delivery of papers could turn into a tense exchange in which voices rose, hands twitched near belts, and the lawman had to rely on calm words rather than quick draws to prevent bloodshed. Subpoenas, too, could stir unease as they compelled men and women to testify, dragging private grievances and guarded secrets into the open light of a courtroom where silence was no longer an option. The sheriff's role in these moments demanded patience and a steady temperament, for he had to embody both firmness and fairness, reminding the reluctant that the law's reach was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. The paperwork may have seemed mundane compared to galloping after fugitives, yet it carried its own dangers, for a cornered man served with a warrant could be more unpredictable than any outlaw in the hills. At the same time, this responsibility underscored the sheriff's place not only as a keeper of order on the streets, but as the living thread that tied the distant voice of government to the daily rhythms of frontier life. In fulfilling these courtly obligations, the sheriff was reminded that justice was not merely about catching criminals or breaking up brawls. It was about ensuring that every citizen, no matter how powerful or poor, was accountable under the same rules. With each paper delivered and each summons enforced, he maintained the fragile bridge between law written on parchment and law lived in practice, proving that in a land where chaos was always a breath away, order was not upheld by chance, but by the steady hand of one who carried both badge and burden. While much of a sheriff's reputation rested on the visible acts of chasing down criminals or standing firm in the face of danger, another layer of his responsibility unfolded in matters that touched every pocketbook and every household in the county. For the lawman was not only a keeper of peace, but also a collector of dues, taxes, fines, and even the careful oversight of county funds often passed through his hands, tying him as closely to the rhythms of daily survival as to the clashes of gunsmoke and pursuit. To many settlers, the arrival of the sheriff at their homestead might not signal an arrest, but a reminder that the county's needs came before personal comfort, that roads had to be maintained, schools supported, and the machinery of government fueled by the coins and bills of its citizens. Yet this duty carried its own storms, for not everyone greeted the sheriff's ledger with the same respect they gave his badge. Some who might have welcomed his protection against bandits bristled at the demand for payment, uttering that the land was already harsh enough without officials dipping into the little they had managed to earn. The sheriff, in these moments, became less a hero and more a negotiator, weighing compassion against obligation, knowing that to excuse one debt too easily could unravel the entire system meant to sustain the community. Cans, too, presented a delicate challenge, for they often followed heated disputes, drunken altercations, or minor violations of order, and collecting them meant revisiting tempers that might not have cooled since the offense. Managing county funds brought yet another layer of responsibility, as here the sheriff was entrusted with the lifeblood of public works and civic projects, money that had to be safeguarded with the same vigilance he showed when guarding prisoners or chasing thieves. Any hint of dishonesty or carelessness could stain not only his name, but the very faith of the people in their institutions, and so the sheriff carried this role with the weight of knowing that each coin placed in or taken from the county coffers reflected directly upon his integrity. Through all these financial burdens, the sheriff revealed himself not only as an enforcer, but as a caretaker, one whose duty stretched beyond handcuffs and gunpowder into the very foundation of how a frontier society sustained itself. The work demanded resilience and discretion, for he was expected to be as fair with a struggling farmer as with a wealthy merchant, and the measure of his character was often judged not by how many criminals he caught, but by how faithfully he handled the unseen flow of money that kept the town alive. Even with ledgers to balance and funds to protect, no one could ever mistake the sheriff's calling for a simple office job, because beneath every duty visible or hidden their post, the constant demand for a courage that could not falter and a resilience that could not wear thin. Life on the frontier was not softened by polished courthouses or reliable patrols. It was jagged and unpredictable, a place where a quiet morning might be shattered by the echo of gunfire across the plains or by the sudden arrival of a rider warning that outlaws had been spotted near the cattle herds. To serve as sheriff in such lands was to accept that danger never announced itself politely, that lawlessness thrived in the shadows between towns, and that the badge was less a symbol of authority than a daily reminder of the risks carried by those who chose to wear it. A sheriff might find himself riding alone through vast stretches of desert, where every rustle of the brush hinted at ambush, or stepping into saloons where the air itself seemed charged with the threat of fists or bullets, or mediating disputes that could escalate into violence with a single wrong word. Each decision carried stakes, not only for his own safety, but for the fragile peace of the settlement he represented, and it took a special kind of steadiness to confront such hazards, without losing sight of fairness and duty. The courage demanded was not simply about standing tall in a duel or chasing an outlaw across barren trails. It was also the quieter, harder kind of courage to remain calm when fear whispered, to hold firm when the weight of responsibility pressed too heavily, and to rise again each day knowing that the dangers faced yesterday would almost certainly return tomorrow. Resilience, too, became the unspoken backbone of the office, because the sheriff's life was a continuous cycle of trials and endurance, nights of little sleep, weeks of unending travel, and the emotional strain of carrying both the expectations of the townsfolk and the hostility. Those who resisted the law all pressed down on him, testing not just his body, but his spirit. And yet, it was precisely in these crucibles of hardship that the figure of the sheriff was forged, not as a flawless hero, untouched by doubt, but as a determined guardian whose grit gave weary settlers the confidence that their lives, though precarious, were not abandoned to chaos. No matter how bravely a sheriff stood his ground in the open streets, or how calmly he kept order in a tense saloon, there lingered always an invisible shadow that followed him long after the day's duties had ended for the two men he arrested, the gangs he disrupted, and the criminals he sent to face. Justice rarely surrendered their grudges as easily as their weapons. The frontier was a land where memories of humiliation and defeat burned hot, and every sheriff who fastened the badge to his chest knew that vengeance could come at any hour. Whether through a sudden ambush on a lonely trail, a whispered plot hatched in the back of a saloon, or even a midnight assault while his family slept in the next room. This reality meant that the sheriff's life was lived with a constant awareness, quiet vigilance that never allowed him to fully relax, even in moments of supposed safety. A simple walk down a dusty main street could feel like moving through a gauntlet of stairs, some friendly, some hostile, and it took more than a revolver to navigate the unease of not knowing which glance might belong to someone waiting for the chance to settle an old score. Home itself, a place where most people sought rest, often became a fortress of caution, the lamplight dimmed and the doors barred, for lawmen understood that a desperate outlaw could mistake family members for pawns in a cruel game of retribution. Yet, rather than bowing to fear, the best sheriffs turned this constant threat into fuel for their resilience, carrying themselves with a kind of steady defiance that told their enemies they would not be broken. It was a heavy price to pay for the privilege of keeping order, for it meant sacrificing much of the ordinary peace that other townsfolk enjoyed. But in the eyes of the community, this sacrifice transformed the sheriff into more than an officer of the law. He became a figure of endurance, someone willing to live each day with danger as an uninvited companion, so that others might rest more easily within the fragile safety of civilization. While the danger of outlaw revenge never faded from a sheriff's horizon, another equally thorny challenge pressed upon his shoulders, one that no revolver could easily resolve and no posse could swiftly ride down. For the frontier was not merely a contest between lawmen and bandits, but a land crowded with competing interests, each pulling at the fragile threads of community life. Settlers carving out homesteads clashed with ranchers who demanded vast open ranges for their herds, and both often found themselves at odds with native tribes whose ancestral lands were being encroached upon by the steady tide of expansion. Into the middle of these tangled disputes stepped the sheriff, his badge less a weapon than a symbol of fragile authority in a landscape where history, survival, and pride collided. Managing such conflicts required patience and diplomacy as much as strength, for every dispute was layered with emotion. With families convinced of their rights, ranchers certain of their livelihoods, and tribal leaders determined to protect what remained of their heritage, the sheriff could not simply silence one side without risking fresh violence from another. And so he often became the reluctant bridge between worlds that saw each other not as neighbors but as obstacles. At times, he would sit for hours in the cramped office of a county courthouse, listening to grievances spill forth, to words threaten to ignite into fists, and with a careful tone and measured language, he would remind them that bloodshed would serve none of their futures. At other times, he rode out to distant clearings, where negotiations with tribal leaders demanded both respect and firmness, for any misstep could deepen mistrust that already ran generations deep. Every such encounter tested his ability to walk the narrow line between justice and survival, for if he appeared too lenient with settlers, the ranchers would brand him as weak. If he leaned toward the settlers might accuse him of betrayal. And if he failed to treat tribal representatives with dignity, peace on the frontier could collapse entirely. What emerged from these delicate negotiations was not always perfect harmony, but often the avoidance of outright war, and though few townsfolk saw the quiet conversations that averted bloodshed, it was in these unseen victories that the true weight of the sheriff's role was revealed. In truth, he was not only the protector of lives, but also the fragile keeper of balance in a world where every group believed their claim was the only rightful one, and it was his burden to hold that balance as long as he wore the badge. Even when the sheriff succeeded in keeping settlers, ranchers, and tribes from tearing one another apart, his trials did not end there, for the battlefield of human conflict stretched beyond dusty roads and contested pastures into the very heart of the town itself, where politics whispered through back rooms and cast long shadows across his badge. In the frontier, a sheriff's authority was not always carved in stone. It was shaped and sometimes twisted by the ambitions of local leaders, the grudges of powerful families, and the shifting loyalties of a community that could praise him one day and plot against him the next. His survival, both in office and sometimes in life, depended not only on his skill with law enforcement, but also on his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of influence, persuasion, and compromise. A sheriff who angered the wrong merchant might find his funding quietly cut when county coffers were tallied, while one who refused to bend to a wealthy rancher's demands could wake to discover half the town suddenly campaigning for his replacement. Elections in those days were not gentle affairs. They were fierce contests of reputation and rumor, where a man's good deeds could be forgotten in the face of a single scandal, whether real or invented. For this reason, the sheriff often carried not just his revolver, but also an acute awareness of who supported him and who waited for the chance to see him fail. His words in public meetings had to be weighed as carefully as his aim during a shootout, because a misplaced phrase could cost him as dearly as a missed bullet. And yet, while politics might weaken or strengthen his position, they also revealed the sheriff's resilience in new ways. The best among them learned to balance integrity with tact, holding firm to the principles of fairness and law, even while maneuvering through webs of gossip and expectation. They understood that protecting the town meant not only stopping gunmen, but also preventing corruption from seeping into the very institutions meant to uphold justice. In this way, the sheriff's badge became both a target and a shield desired by some, despised by others, but always a symbol that his role was never as simple as chasing criminals. He was, in truth, a man caught between duty and politics, standing in the crossroads where survival often depended as much on diplomacy with town councils as on bravery in the face of outlaws. Unlike soldiers appointed by distant governments or marshals sent from faraway territories, the sheriff's power was born directly from the will of the very people he was sworn to protect. For it was the townsfolk themselves who cast their votes and placed the badge upon his chest. This gave the office a peculiar kind of intimacy, a closeness that bound the sheriff not only to the law, but also to the shifting moods and loyalties of his neighbors, since every handshake in the marketplace, every nod at a Sunday gathering, and every whispered rumor in a saloon could shape the outcome of the next election. His authority was never absolute. It was tethered to the trust, or at times the resentment of the community, and that fragile bond could both elevate him to a position of honor and drag him into the undertow of politics. Elections in frontier towns often carried the charged atmosphere of both celebration and rivalry, where candidates walked the same dusty streets as their voters, making promises, not in lofty speeches, but in conversations over fence rails inside general stores or beneath the glow of lanterns outside crowded taverns. A sheriff who had protected the town from bandits might find that triumph celebrated in ballots cast with gratitude. Yet another could just as easily discover that one misstep, a perceived insult, a disputed arrest, or an unpopular decision was enough to cost him the trust of those whose lives he had risked his own to safeguard. In this sense, the office of sheriff was as much about reputation as it was about enforcement, and political ties wove through his daily existence like threads that could either secure or unravel his position. What this meant in practice was that the sheriff often lived under the constant pressure of pleasing a community that was rarely united in its opinions. Settlers demanded protection of their crops. Ranchers wanted assurance their herds could graze freely. Merchants expected stability to safeguard their trade. And each group measured the sheriff's worth according to how well he defended their particular interests. The political ties created by elections thus became a double-edged sword. They gave him legitimacy that outlaws could not ignore, but they also tethered him to the ceaseless demands of a restless and divided citizenry. To wear the badge then was not only to enforce the law, but also to walk the perilous line of public favor, knowing that the same people who cheered him as a protector could, with a stroke of a pen on a ballot, decide his time as lawman had come to an end. Because his power was tied so closely to the will of the people, a sheriff quickly learned that survival in office depended on something more enduring than charm or political maneuvering. Thus, it demanded the careful cultivation of a reputation that could withstand both the whispers of tavern gossip and the scrutiny of men whose livelihoods hung on his decisions. Fairness, toughness, and reliability were not lofty ideals to be spoken of in speeches. They were the qualities townsfolk weighed each day as they watched how their sheriff handled quarrels, confronted danger, and honored his word, a key in a world where rumor traveled faster than a rider on horseback. One rash action or one sign of favoritism could erode years of trust, while consistency in judgment and steadiness under pressure built a legacy that no outlaw's bullet could easily tarnish. Fairness was perhaps the most difficult to maintain, for it required the sheriff to rise above the tangled loyalties of a frontier town, where friendships, debts, and rivalries pulled at him from every side. When two neighbors disputed the boundaries of their land, or when a wealthy rancher's son was caught in a drunken brawl, the community looked to the sheriff not to bend toward power or influence, but to uphold the law with the same weight for rich and poor alike. To be fair meant risking anger, but it also meant planting seeds of respect that grew even among those who disagreed with his verdicts. Toughness, on the other hand, was measured not merely by a quick hand with a revolver, but by the unyielding resolve to stand firm when chaos threatened to sweep the town into disorder. A sheriff could not flinch at the sight of armed men swaggering into a saloon, nor could he waver when called to confront thieves hiding in the canyons beyond the settlement. His toughness was not cruelty, but a steady refusal to be intimidated, the kind of strength that reassured frightened townsfolk that someone stood between them and the dangers of the frontier. And reliability was the glue that held these qualities together, for without it, neither fairness nor toughness could carry weight. People needed to know that when a sheriff gave his word, it would be kept, that when trouble rose in the dead of night, he could be counted on to appear, and that his judgment would not shift with the wind of convenience or fear. A reputation for reliability transformed the badge from a piece of metal into a covenant of trust, one that convinced the community to follow his lead even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The weight of such a reputation meant that the sheriff could never truly separate one duty from another, for his life was not neatly divided into law enforcement on one side and politics or community service on the other. Instead, the role became a seamless weaving of responsibilities, each thread pulling against the others, yet forming a fabric strong enough to hold a town together in uncertain times. His daily routine often began with the stern demands of policing, tracking a thief, quelling a saloon brawl, escorting prisoners across miles of wilderness. But before the dust had settled on one crisis, he might be called to mediate a dispute over land rights, attend a council meeting where budgets and taxes were argued, or reassured a frightened family whose safety felt fragile in a land that knew no lasting peace. What made the sheriff unique in the frontier landscape was precisely this blending of roles, for he could not hide behind the singular title of lawman. To the settlers, he was both guardian and negotiator. To merchants, he was a stabilizer of trade. To town leaders, he was a political figure whose choices shaped elections. And to families, he was a visible reminder that order could exist even in the harshest of places. One moment, he might be enforcing a law with the firmness of a judge's gavel, and the next, he might be offering words of comfort to a widow or arranging for resources to be distributed fairly in times of scarcity. His presence in the community was both practical and symbolic, an assurance that the line between chaos and stability still held firm. This constant balancing act demanded an extraordinary adaptability, for the sheriff had to speak the language of both power and compassion. He needed the authority to face down armed men without trembling, but also the humility to listen when townsfolk poured out their frustrations, their hopes, and their fears. Each decision required him to weigh not only the letter of the law, but also the long-term well-being of the people, for a harsh judgment might bring immediate order, but at the cost of deepening divisions, while leniency could win favor, yet weaken respect for the rules. The craft of his work, then, was not simply the enforcement of written statutes, but the ongoing creation of trust in a land where every day tested the fragile bonds that tied a community together. In carrying out this delicate blend of policing, politics, and community protection, the sheriff could not lean upon the kind of detailed systems, procedures, and bureaucratic networks that define modern law enforcement. For the frontier offered no thick manuals of regulation, no ready chain of command, and often not even a courthouse within riding distance. Instead, every decision rested squarely upon the weight of his own judgment. And in a land where written laws existed only in fragments and enforcement was sparse, that judgment often carried more authority than any official document. When a quarrel erupted between neighbors, or when a stagecoach robbery demanded pursuit, there was no central office to consult, no radio dispatch to call, and no backup arriving in minutes. There was only the sheriff, his instincts, and the measure of wisdom he had cultivated through experience. This reliance on personal judgment meant that the badge was not simply a token of office, but a constant test of character. For every choice set a precedent that townsfolk remembered long after the dust of conflict had settled. If he was too harsh in punishing minor offenses, resentment grew like weeds. If he was too lenient with dangerous men, fear spread faster than wildfire. Each verdict he rendered became part of his legacy, shaping the trust or distrust of those who depended on him for order. At times, the sheriff's role resembled that of a frontier judge, delivering rulings in the moment with no higher court to appeal to. And such rulings could mean the difference between peace restored or feuds that simmered for generations. Yet this burden also offered a strange kind of freedom, for without layers of distant authority dictating his every move, the sheriff could tailor justice to the unique circumstances of his town. He could weigh not just the crime, but the context, understanding that a hungry man who stole bread posed a different challenge than a bandit who robbed a stagecoach at gunpoint. Such discretion demanded wisdom beyond mere toughness, a capacity to see people not only as offenders, but as members of a fragile community whose survival depended on balance as much as punishment. It was this reliance on personal judgment, more than any formal rulebook, that carved the sheriff's reputation, reminding both friend and foe that law in the Wild West was as much about the man who enforced it as the codes he swore to uphold. To live beneath the weight of that badge was to accept a life defined by constant tension, where each sunrise promised new trials and each sunset carried the uneasy relief of having endured another day. The sheriff's existence was not one of ease, but of perpetual risk. For every decision, every arrest, every act of mediation carried the possibility of violent reprisal, and the knowledge that enemies lurked beyond the edges of town meant that even in moments of quiet, danger lingered like a shadow. Exhaustion became a familiar companion, creeping into his bones after long nights spent riding across empty plains in pursuit of fugitives, or after endless hours mediating disputes that seemed to multiply faster than they could be resolved. Rest was scarce, and when it came, it was fragile, interrupted by the knock of a messenger at the door or the distant crack of gunfire demanding his return to duty. Yet, for all the hardship, the sheriff's role carried a respect that few others in the community could claim. For the people understood, even if only dimly, the sacrifices woven into his service. Merchants opened their shops each morning with greater confidence because he walked the streets. Ranchers sent their herds to graze, knowing he stood as a barrier against rustlers. Families slept more soundly with the assurance that someone bore the burden of vigilance on their behalf. This respect was not always spoken aloud, nor was it free of criticism, but it revealed itself in the nod of a townsman tipping his hat, in the quiet gratitude of a widow who felt protected, or in the children who whispered tales of the sheriff's bravery, as though he were the living embodiment of justice itself. It was this respect that kept many sheriffs from laying down the badge, even when exhaustion pressed hard and danger grew unbearable. For, in the eyes of their communities, they were not merely officials bound by duty, but guardians whose presence gave meaning to the very idea of law on the frontier. To be sheriff was to live on the edge of risk and weariness, but it was also to stand as a figure of stability in a world constantly threatening to unravel. And while the job might consume a man's strength, it also offered him the rare honor of being remembered, not just as an enforcer of rules, but as the one who, despite every hardship, held the fragile promise of civilization together. As the years passed, and stories of frontier towns spread beyond their dusty streets into newspapers, dime novels, and the whispered tales of travelers, the figure of the sheriff transformed from a working lawman into something larger than life, a symbol etched into the collective imagination of the Wild West. No longer was he merely a man balancing taxes, mediating disputes, and patrolling miles of open prairie. He became the archetype of justice, standing alone against chaos, the resolute guardian whose courage and cunning defined the very idea of order in a lawless land. These stories, sometimes embellished and often romanticized, took root in the culture because they captured the essence of what townsfolk had always recognized, that a single man wearing a badge could shape the fortunes of a community, protect the vulnerable, and hold at bay the forces of disorder that threatened to sweep across the frontier. In folklore, the sheriff's actions were magnified, and every arrest or showdown became a tale of daring and ingenuity, feeding a mythology that would endure long after the actual frontier towns faded into history. The saloon fights, the cattle rustlers, the stagecoach robberies, they were no longer simply incidents of daily law enforcement. They were transformed into episodes of legend, illustrating the courage required to face danger without hesitation, the integrity demanded to maintain trust among settlers, and the resilience necessary to survive in a world where law was fragile and lives hung in the balance. Even the quiet acts like mediating a dispute over a stolen chicken or ensuring a widow's safety were woven into the narrative as signs of moral strength, painting the sheriff as both hero and arbiter, a figure whose presence promised that civilization could hold firm even at the edge of the untamed frontier. Over time, this image seeped into popular culture, inspiring countless retellings in plays, books, and eventually film. Each iteration drawing on the blend of reality and legend that surrounded the frontier sheriff. The tales emphasized bravery, fairness, and relentless dedication, while often smoothing over the exhaustion, politics, personal sacrifice that defined the real life of these men. Yet, even in these myths, the core truth remained that the sheriff, whether in history or imagination, represented the tenuous balance between law and lawlessness, the constant negotiation between duty and danger, and the enduring human need for order in the midst of uncertainty. The badge, the gun belt, and the determined gaze all became symbols that transcended time, ensuring that the sheriff's story, in all its complexity, would never truly fade from memory. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the dusty streets of the frontier towns settled into an uneasy, quiet, one could pause to reflect on the life of a Wild West sheriff and the extraordinary balance he maintained between duty, danger, and community. A sheriff's existence was far removed from the sensationalized gunfights and cinematic showdowns that popular culture often presents. It was a life defined by responsibility, resilience, and an ever-present tension between law and chaos. These men were not merely enforcers of statutes written on fragile sheets of paper. They were leaders, mediators, and symbols of order in regions where civilization's reach was tenuous at best. From the moment they rose at dawn to the last lantern-lit patrol through quieting streets, sheriffs operated in an environment that demanded constant vigilance, knowing that their decisions could mean the difference between safety and disaster for the townsfolk they served. Operating within small frontier towns, often with limited resources, authority extended well beyond the wooden boardwalks and main streets into the vast stretches of rural counties, where a lawless landscape tested both courage and ingenuity. Here, the sheriff had to enforce laws across miles of open plains, respond to incidents that ranged from cattle rustling to stagecoach robberies, and break up fights that spilled from crowded saloons into the streets. Yet these violent encounters were only part of the picture. Equally critical were the daily, less glamorous responsibilities, negotiating disputes between neighbors, collecting taxes and fines, ensuring prisoners were safely transported, and even managing county funds. Each task demanded not only a keen understanding of human nature, but also the strength to maintain authority while fostering cooperation and trust among a diverse population of settlers, ranchers, and occasionally native tribes. The sheriff's work was rarely solitary, yet even when deputies were present, much of the burden fell squarely on his shoulders. Armed with basic weapons like revolvers, rifles, and shotguns, These men faced the constant possibility of retaliation from criminals, the unpredictable violence of drunken cowboys, and the pressures of enforcing both local ordinances and broader federal or territorial laws. Organizing posses to pursue fugitives, serving warrants and subpoenas, and standing firm in the face of dangerous adversaries were all intrinsic to the role, yet behind every arrest or skirmish lay the careful judgment and personal discretion that set a capable sheriff apart from his peers. Unlike today, where law enforcement often operates within structured systems and layered chains of command, a frontier sheriff relied on instinct, experience, and a deep understanding of the people and places he served. Politics, too, played an inescapable role in shaping a sheriff's life. Usually elected by townspeople, a sheriff was bound to the will of the community, navigating local power struggles while maintaining the respect necessary to execute justice fairly and effectively. Success demanded a reputation for fairness, toughness, and reliability. For without these qualities, even the bravest lawman would quickly find himself undermined or sidelined. Balancing justice with diplomacy was not merely a matter of preference, but a survival skill, as a single misstep could inflame rivalries or alienate the very people whose cooperation was essential to maintaining order, despite the ever-present dangers and exhausting workload. Sheriffs were respected figures whose presence reassured the community. Their lives, though fraught with peril and long hours of unrelenting responsibility, were a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring human desire for security and fairness. Over time, the sheriff became more than a man with a badge. He became a symbol, central to the folklore and legend of the Wild West. Tales of bravery, sagacious judgment, and unflinching resolves circulated far and wide, blending historical truth with myth, yet always preserving the essence of what it meant to protect and serve on a frontier where law was fragile and life was precious. In the quiet moments when the streets were empty and the town lay beneath a star-studded sky, the sheriff could finally reflect on the extraordinary life he led, a life woven from duty, danger, and the unwavering commitment to a community that depended on him. It was a life of sacrifice and honor, of daily courage in a world where threats could appear as suddenly as a storm across the plains. And though exhausted by his labors, he could take solace in the knowledge that his work had left an indelible mark, that the town slept a little safer, and that his reputation for fairness, toughness, and reliability had inspired trust in those who needed it most. So, as you drift into your own quiet evening, consider the sheriffs of the Wild West not just as figures of legend, but as men who lived lives of vigilance, wisdom, and courage. Their stories remind us that leadership is rarely glamorous, that courage often manifests in persistence rather than spectacle, and that protecting the community requires both strength and compassion. Sleep well tonight, knowing that in history, as in life, there are those who stand watch, ensuring that others may rest safely. Good night.